Somewhere in Africa, between 1 and 5 million years ago, one of your ancestors picked up a mushroom and ate it. They had probably eaten mushrooms before. Mushrooms grew everywhere on the savanna, on rotting wood, on soil, and most importantly, on the dung of the massive herds of cattle and wildebeest that ancient humans followed for food. Mushrooms were part of the diet. They were calories. They were something you ate when you found them. But this particular mushroom was different. And about 20 minutes after eating it, your ancestor found out why. The world changed, colors shifted, the edges of things became unreal, the sounds of the savanna became overwhelming and then somehow beautiful. The boundary between themselves and everything around them, between the individual and the group and the grass and the sky, dissolved. And somewhere inside that dissolving, something happened to the way they thought, to the way they perceived, to the way they connected patterns and made meaning out of the world. We will never know exactly what that first person experienced. We will never know what they did next, or what they told the others, or whether anyone believed them. But the mushrooms were there, and the humans were there, and eventually those two things collided, and what came after may have changed everything. Today we are talking about when ancient humans first got high on mushrooms. Not as a story about drugs, as a story about what happens when a species stumbles onto something that rewires the way it sees the world, and what that might have done to us. Before we talk about when humans found the mushroom, we need to talk about where it came from, because the timeline is staggering. The psilocybin mushroom, the specific type of fungus that produces the compound that causes hallucinations, has existed on this planet for approximately 75 million years. To put that in perspective, psilocybin mushrooms were already ancient when the dinosaurs went extinct. They were ancient when the first primates appeared. They were ancient when the first hominins walked upright across the African savanna. And here is the part that most people don't know. Psilocybin mushrooms grow on dung, specifically on the dung of grazing animals, cattle, wildebeest, buffalo. The compound psilocybin evolved in the fungus, researchers now believe, as a defense mechanism. By producing a chemical that causes profound neurological disruption in animals that eat the mushroom, the fungus discourages consumption and protects its spores. The same chemical that gives humans a psychedelic experience was originally designed by evolution to be an unpleasant deterrent. It did not work as intended, because ancient humans, following herds of cattle and wildebeest across the African savanna, eating everything those animals left behind, including mushrooms growing from their dung, would have encountered psilocybin mushrooms not occasionally, not rarely, but regularly, continuously, for millions of years. A 2021 paper published in the journal Frontiers in Neuroscience made this point explicitly, suggesting that psilocybin mushrooms were likely ingested by our hominid ancestors beginning in the Pliocene epoch, that is, roughly 5 million years ago, not intentionally, not ceremonially, just as foragers picking up whatever food was available, with no understanding of what they were consuming or why it was doing what it was doing to them. The mushroom found us. We didn't find it. We were standing right next to it, eating the same dung piles it grew on, for millions of years before anyone understood what it was. Here is the question nobody can fully answer, but everyone wants to. What happened the first time an ancient human ate enough of a psilocybin mushroom to actually feel the effects? The honest answer is that the first time was probably terrifying. Psilocybin takes between 20 and 40 minutes to produce effects. In that window, the ancient human who had eaten the mushroom would have felt nothing. They might have moved on, started doing something else, forgotten about the mushroom entirely, and then it started. The visual changes come first, a subtle shimmer at the edges of things, colors becoming slightly more saturated, geometric patterns appearing when you close your eyes. For someone with no framework for understanding what was happening, no prior experience, no cultural context, this would have been deeply alarming. The world was changing, something was wrong, and unlike alcohol, which produces familiar feelings of loosening and warmth that are easy to recognize and categorize, psilocybin produces something that has no natural analog. Nothing else in the natural environment causes this. There is no way to prepare for it if you have never experienced it. So the first reaction was almost certainly fear, possibly running, possibly screaming, possibly collapsing and waiting for whatever was happening to stop. And then, for those who didn't run away and who experienced a moderate dose, something else. The fear gave way to something that most people who have taken psilocybin describe as the most profound feeling of their lives. A sense of connection, of meaning, of being part of something vastly larger than themselves. The boundaries of the self becoming permeable. the world becoming extraordinarily, overwhelmingly beautiful. One thing researchers are fairly certain of: whoever experienced this first went back and told other people, because that is what humans do. We share information about food, what is good, what is bad, what is surprising, and a mushroom that makes the world melt and fill with meaning is not the kind of thing you keep to yourself. What happened after that first experience, how quickly the knowledge spread, how it was interpreted, how the group made sense of something that had no prior explanation, we cannot know. But we know that across every culture that has ever encountered psilocybin mushrooms, the reaction was never simply to catalog them as food. Every culture, without exception, treated them as something else entirely, something sacred, something that opened a door that did not exist during normal waking life. That consistency across continents, across thousands of years, across cultures with zero contact with each other, suggests that the experience itself is powerful enough to demand a spiritual interpretation, not because the ancients were primitive or superstitious, but because the experience genuinely feels like something beyond the ordinary, something that requires a bigger frame than "I ate a plant and felt funny." Here is where we have to be honest about what we know and what we are inferring, because in this area, people often mix them up. The oldest hard evidence of deliberate psilocybin mushroom use comes from rock art. In the Tassili N'Ajjer Plateau in Algeria, a remote high desert area in the Sahara that was 9,000 years ago, a lush grassland, there are cave paintings dated to between 6,000 and 9,000 years ago, during a period archaeologists call the Roundhead phase. In some of these paintings, human figures are shown holding objects that researchers interpret as mushrooms. Dotted lines extend from the mushrooms to the heads of the figures. Some figures appear to be floating. The imagery is unmistakably consistent with the visual experience of a psychedelic state. In Villar del Humo in Spain, rock paintings dated to roughly 6,000 years ago depict what appears to be psilocybe hispanica, a specific species of psychedelic mushroom native to the region, arranged in a ceremonial context, suggesting deliberate ritual use. In Australia, rock art in the Kimberley region, dated to approximately 10,000 BCE, contains mushroom imagery that some researchers interpret as psychedelic in nature, though this remains debated. In Central America, the evidence is most concrete. Stone mushroom sculptures, called mushroom stones, have been found at dozens of sites in Guatemala, Mexico, Honduras and El Salvador, dating from 500 BCE to 900 CE. These are not decorative objects, they are ceremonial artifacts. Among the Aztecs, psilocybin mushrooms had a name, Teonanacatl. Translated directly, it means flesh of the gods. These were not drugs in the modern recreational sense. They were sacred objects, gateways. The Aztec priests who consumed them during ceremonies believed they were accessing a direct line to the divine, that the visions produced by the mushroom were not hallucinations but communications, not a chemical reaction in the brain, but a conversation with something beyond the physical world. The Spanish missionaries who arrived in the 16th century were horrified. They recognized immediately that the mushroom ceremonies were the spiritual center of Aztec religious life, and they spent decades trying to stamp them out, trying to burn the records, trying to make the practice disappear. But a 16th century Franciscan friar named Bernardino de Sahagún documented everything anyway, leaving behind the most detailed account of ancient psilocybin use in human history. The missionaries failed, the mushrooms survived. They are still used in ceremonial contexts in parts of Mexico today, an unbroken chain of practice reaching back thousands of years. But the Aztecs and the Saharan cave painters were not the only ancient civilizations with a suspected relationship with psychedelic substances. In ancient Greece, one of the most prestigious and secretive religious ceremonies ever held, the Eleusinian Mysteries, attended by Plato, Aristotle, Sophocles, and thousands of ordinary Athenians over 900 years, centered on the consumption of a drink called kykeon. For decades, classicists debated what was in it. Then in 2021, researchers analyzing dental calculus from a burial site connected to the mysteries found traces of ergot, a fungus that produces compounds chemically similar to LSD and psilocybin. The greatest minds of ancient Greece may have been getting high on fungus at the center of their most sacred ritual. The thread runs everywhere. Once you start looking, it is impossible to find a major ancient civilization that did not have some relationship, ceremonial, medicinal, or spiritual, with a psychoactive substance. The question is not whether ancient humans used mushrooms. The question is when they started and what that relationship made them. Now we get to the theory that half the internet loves and the other half thinks is completely insane. In 1992, an American ethnobotanist named Terence McKenna published a book called Food of the Gods. In it, he proposed what he called the stoned ape hypothesis, and it is exactly what it sounds like. McKenna argued that the transition from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens, the sudden, dramatic explosion of human brain size and cognitive capability that happened somewhere between 200,000 and 700,000 years ago, was catalyzed by the regular consumption of psilocybin mushrooms. The argument goes like this. Ancient hominins following cattle herds across the African savanna regularly consumed mushrooms growing from cattle dung, including psilocybin mushrooms. At low doses, McKenna argued, psilocybin enhances visual acuity, specifically edge detection, the ability to distinguish outlines sharply, which would have made hunters better at spotting prey. Groups that consumed the mushrooms would have had a survival advantage. At medium doses, McKenna argued, psilocybin increases energy and libido, leading to more reproduction and greater genetic diversity within groups. At higher doses, the mushroom promotes social bonding, reduces individual ego boundaries, and, critically, activates what McKenna called the language-forming regions of the brain. His argument was that psilocybin experiences, by producing visions that needed to be described and shared, created the evolutionary pressure for language, that the first humans to develop symbolic communication did so because they needed words for what they had seen inside a psychedelic experience. It is a beautiful theory. It is also, in the strict scientific sense, almost impossible to prove or disprove, which is why it has been sitting on the edge of mainstream science for 30 years, taken seriously by some researchers and dismissed entirely by others. What serious researchers do agree on is this: the human brain tripled in size over roughly 2 million years, in a process so rapid by evolutionary standards that it remains poorly understood. Something drove that expansion, something changed the way hominins processed information, formed social bonds, and communicated. Whether that something included mushrooms, we genuinely cannot say with certainty, but the mushrooms were there. They were growing in the dung of the animals our ancestors hunted. They were available continuously for millions of years, and they contain a compound that, when consumed, fundamentally alters the way the brain forms connections, temporarily dissolving the boundaries between established thought patterns and allowing new ones to form. You do not have to believe the stoned ape theory to find that fact remarkable. Here is the neuroscience, because it is genuinely extraordinary, and it explains why ancient humans, once they understood what the mushroom did, would not have abandoned it. Psilocybin works by binding to serotonin receptors in the brain, specifically the 5-HT2A receptor, which is concentrated heavily in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for complex thought, social behavior, and self-reflection. When psilocybin binds to these receptors, it does something unusual. It dramatically reduces the activity of what neuroscientists call the default mode network. The default mode network is, roughly speaking, the brain circuit responsible for your sense of self. It is the network that generates the continuous internal monologue, the voice in your head that says, I, that narrates your experience, that reminds you where you are in the social hierarchy and what other people think of you. It is also the network most associated with rumination, anxiety, depression, and rigid habitual thinking. When psilocybin suppresses the default mode network, the self temporarily gets quiet, and in that quiet, the rest of the brain does something unexpected. It forms connections it would never normally form. Brain regions that don't usually communicate start talking to each other. The visual cortex connects with areas processing emotion. The areas processing sound connect with areas processing meaning. The result is an experience of extraordinary richness and novelty, a brain that is, briefly, operating in a completely different mode. For an ancient human, what would this have meant? It would have meant seeing the world differently, literally. Patterns in the natural environment that the brain normally filters out because they are not immediately useful for survival, becoming visible, even overwhelming. New connections forming between observations that had previously seemed unrelated. A sense of profound meaning attaching itself to things that normally passed without notice. And, crucially, across cultures, across thousands of years, across every documented use of psilocybin in ceremonial contexts, the experience produces one consistent psychological outcome: a dramatic reduction in the fear of death, combined with an increased sense of connection to other people and to the natural world. For a small group of humans trying to survive on a dangerous savanna, constantly threatened by predators and disease and starvation, a substance that made you feel less afraid and more bonded to your group was not a trivial thing. It was potentially the most valuable thing in your environment. So, when did ancient humans first get high on mushrooms? The conservative answer, supported by solid archaeological evidence, at least 9,000 years ago in North Africa, at least 6,000 years ago in Spain and the Sahara, and at least 3,000 years ago in Central America, where they became woven into the deepest layer of spiritual and ceremonial life, given the name flesh of the gods, and used continuously until Spanish missionaries arrived and tried to burn the practice out of existence. The more speculative answer, supported by the biology of where psilocybin mushrooms grow and what ancient hominins ate, possibly millions of years ago, not deliberately, not ceremonially, but accidentally, as a side effect of following cattle herds and eating whatever those herds left behind. The most provocative answer, which serious scientists debate and cannot resolve, maybe the mushroom didn't just find us, maybe it changed us. Maybe the explosive growth of the human brain, the development of language, the birth of symbolic thought and art and ritual, maybe some part of all of that traces back to a small group of hominins on an African plain, eating mushrooms from cattle dung, having their minds blown open in ways they had no words for. We will probably never know for certain. But the next time you eat a mushroom, any mushroom, consider this. Your ancestors and fungi have been in a relationship for millions of years, a relationship that, somewhere along the way, produced cave paintings and Aztec ceremonies and rock art in the Algerian desert, and, possibly, the brain you are using right now to think about all of this. Not bad for something that grows on cow dung. And here is the thought that makes all of this personal rather than just historical. Neuroscientists studying psilocybin today describe it as doing something the brain sometimes does, naturally, suppressing the default internal voice, dissolving habitual thought patterns, allowing entirely new connections to form between brain regions that don't normally communicate. The mushroom doesn't create the experience from nothing. It removes a filter. It lets the brain operate in a mode it is capable of, but rarely enters. Your ancestors stumbled through that door millions of years ago in a field of cattle dung on the African savanna. Whatever they found on the other side, the cave paintings, the ceremonies, the gods, the language, the art, the meaning, they brought some of it back with them, passed it forward, encoded it in ritual and symbol and stone. We are still carrying it.